In the blistering heat of a 1963 Mississippi summer, the town of Willow Creek seemed frozen in time. A place where people still addressed elders as sir and ma'am, where Sunday sermons filled wooden churches with the scent of old hymnals and warm biscuits, and where the past was not history, but an ever-present shadow. Among the dusty roads and creaking porches of Willow Creek lived Elijah Turner, a black man in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands weathered from years of farm labor. To the white folks of the town, he was invisible at best and suspicious at worst. But those who really knew Elijah, like his mama who made peach cobbler every Saturday or the kids who ran to him for homemade slingshots, they saw the quiet fire behind his tired eyes. Elijah worked as a handyman, fixing fences, patching roofs, and doing the kind of work others didn't want to touch. He never complained, never raised his voice, and always tipped his hat. Most of the town's white residents tolerated him because he was useful. But they never saw him as equal. That was simply the way things were. One day, as the cicadas hummed in the trees and the sun beat down like a hammer, Elijah received an unexpected knock on his door. Standing there was Sheriff Walter Briggs, a stout man in his 50s with a face like leather and a badge that weighed heavier than his conscience. "Elijah," the sheriff said, tugging at his belt, "I need a favor." Elijah looked at the man, eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of favor, Sheriff?" Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat. "There's been an accident. The Carson family, you know them, their truck flipped on Highway 49, just past the creek. The wife's banged up pretty bad. We need someone to help lift the wreckage. Ain't many strong backs in town right now. Can I count on you?" Elijah hesitated. The Carsons were among the richest families in Willow Creek. Old money, old ideas, and a whole lot of pride. He'd fixed their porch once, and Mr. Carson had handed him the money like it was diseased. Still, Elijah nodded. "All right, Sheriff. I'll come." The scene at the crash site was worse than Elijah expected. The Carson truck was overturned in a ditch, smoke curling from the engine. Margaret Carson, a woman in her early 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair now stained with blood and dust, was trapped under the frame, her leg pinned. Her husband, Charles Carson, stood nearby, yelling into a broken radio, his voice cracking with desperation. Their 2 kids, Emily, 9, and Bobby, 6, huddled under a tree, crying. When Elijah arrived, Charles Carson turned, his face hardening. "What's he doing here?" he barked. Sheriff Briggs raised a hand. "He's the only one strong enough to lift that frame." Charles looked at Elijah like he was looking at a stray dog, then back at his wife, who was moaning in pain. After a pause that hung heavy with ego and prejudice, he grunted, "Fine." Without waiting for thanks or permission, Elijah walked over to the wreckage. He crouched beside Margaret, meeting her fearful gaze. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I'm gonna get you out of here, but I need you to stay still. This'll hurt some." She looked away, tears in her eyes. Elijah dug his heels into the dirt, wrapped his arms around the twisted metal, and heaved with everything he had. Muscles burning, sweat pouring down his back, he lifted just enough for Sheriff Briggs to slide a crate under the frame and pull Margaret free. She screamed as her leg came loose, but it was done. She was out. Elijah collapsed onto the ground, chest heaving. Charles Carson knelt beside his wife, checking her vitals. Then, after a moment of silence, he looked up. "You saved her," he said, the words catching like barbed wire in his throat. "I just did what was right," Elijah replied, not meeting his eyes. Back in town, word spread fast. In a place like Willow Creek, news moved quicker than wind through cornfields. Elijah saved a white woman. He pulled her out of the fire himself. They say Mr. Carson shook his hand. People didn't know what to make of it. Some said Elijah was a hero. Others grumbled that it was a one-time thing, not enough to change anything. A few days later, Elijah received a note. It was written on expensive paper, the kind you only saw at weddings or funerals. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar. "Mr. Turner. My name is Emily Carson. You saved my mama. I want to thank you. Can I visit? Emily, age 9. Elijah stared at the note for a long time. A child's gratitude was honest, unfiltered. He smiled slightly and wrote back. Dear Miss Emily. You're welcome. You can visit on Saturday if your parents say it's all right. Mr. Turner. When Saturday came, Elijah stood on his porch, unsure what to expect. At noon sharp, a blue Cadillac pulled up. Out came little Emily, holding a basket. She marched up to Elijah, face determined. My mama made you cornbread, she said, handing him the basket. And Daddy says he owes you. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Does he now? Emily nodded. He said you saved our family, and that makes you family too. That was the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of Willow Creek began to shift ever so slightly. Most folks kept to their old ways, crossing the street when they saw Elijah, refusing to look him in the eye, or pretending the incident on Highway 49 never happened. But the Carson family, particularly young Emily, had changed. Every Saturday at noon, without fail, Emily would appear on Elijah's porch with something in hand, a peach pie, a library book to lend, or questions about the world outside her small town. Elijah, though hesitant at first, grew fond of her company. He'd tell her stories about stars, teach her how to carve wood animals, and let her feed his chickens. Her curiosity was boundless, and her honesty refreshing. But not everyone approved of their growing friendship. At the town's general store, whispers turned sharp. Carson's girl visiting that Turner boy's house? It ain't right. Next thing you know, they'll be sharing supper. One afternoon, Charles Carson paid Elijah an unannounced visit. He stood rigidly on the porch, hat in hand, while Elijah watered his tomatoes. Elijah, he said with a stiff nod. Can we talk? Elijah dried his hands on a cloth. We can. Charles cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Emily talks about you a lot. Says you're teaching her things. Says she wants to bring Bobby next time too. I don't mind, Elijah replied. Charles shifted. Look, I'm grateful for what you did, don't think I'll ever forget it. But not everyone sees it that way. There's talk in town about impropriety. Elijah looked the man in the eye. You mean the color of my skin? Charles hesitated, then nodded slightly. I'm trying to protect my family. And what about me? Elijah said quietly. Who protects mine? The silence between them was thick. Charles looked away. I'll talk to Margaret. Maybe we can work something out. That night, Elijah sat on his porch, the stars twinkling above. He thought of his father, who had marched in Selma, and his grandfather, who had picked cotton and dreamed of freedom he never saw. Would they be proud? Or would they warn him not to get too close? The next day, a brick was thrown through Elijah's window. A note wrapped around it read, "Know your place." He didn't report it. He just swept up the glass and boarded the window. But something inside him cracked. Later that week, Margaret Carson came to see him. Her leg was still in a brace, but she walked with purpose. Elijah, she said, placing a pie on his table. I'm sorry. For what? For the world, she replied. For how it treats people like you. And for how I treated you. He nodded, unsure how to respond. I want to help, she said. You deserve more. You think one pie can change 100 years? She smiled sadly. No. But maybe a pie today, and a handshake tomorrow, and a letter to the school board next week. Elijah chuckled. Now you sound like my mama. The Carson family became something new in town, a bridge. Charles, reluctantly at first, began inviting Elijah to fix things not just for him, but alongside him. They built a barn together, and when it was done, Charles offered Elijah a cold soda and said, "Good work, partner." It wasn't a revolution, but it was a ripple. Then came the incident at the diner. Elijah walked in one afternoon. The colored section had been removed after the Civil Rights Act passed, but the air still bristled when he stepped inside. He took a seat near the back, ordered a slice of pecan pie, and tried to keep to himself. Minutes later, a man stormed in. Ray Dugan, a trucker known for his temper and Confederate flag bumper sticker. He saw Elijah sitting, and his face twisted with fury. "You don't belong here," Ray barked. Elijah looked up calmly. "I'm just eating." Ray knocked the plate off the table. "Not anymore." Just then, the door opened again and in came Charles Carson and Sheriff Briggs. They saw what was happening and didn't hesitate. Charles grabbed Ray by the collar. "That man saved my wife's life. You got a problem with him, you got a problem with me." The sheriff nodded. "Ray, you want to spend the night in jail again?" Ray backed off, grumbling. The room fell silent as Charles helped Elijah to his feet. "Sorry about your pie," he said. Elijah grinned. "It wasn't sweet enough anyway." That night, Emily sat on Elijah's porch with her journal. "I want to write your story," she said. "Why?" "Because someday people will want to know about the man who changed everything." Elijah shook his head. "I didn't change the world, little miss. Just fixed a truck and broke a window." "No," she said. "You changed my family." But not everyone was ready for change. As Elijah walked home from church one Sunday, he noticed a car tailing him. It was dark green, with no plates. It followed him for 3 blocks, then vanished. The next morning, his front yard was littered with garbage and a dead chicken. The message was clear: you don't belong. But Elijah didn't flinch. He cleaned up, buried the chicken, and painted his fence bright white. "Let them see me," he said to himself. "I ain't hiding." Summer turned to fall, and Willow Creek's amber leaves fluttered like silent witnesses to a storm brewing just beneath the calm. Elijah Turner's quiet defiance and his friendship with the Carson family had become the heartbeat of hushed conversations, narrowed eyes, and secret meetings held in barns and backyards. One Friday evening, as the last rays of sun dipped below the Mississippi hills, Elijah was working late repairing the steps of the old Baptist church when Reverend Clayford, a kind-eyed man in his 60s, stepped out with a heavy heart. "Elijah," he said gently, "you need to be careful." "I've been careful my whole life, Reverend," Elijah replied, wiping his brow. The Reverend stepped closer. "This is different. You're not invisible anymore. And that scares people more than anything." Elijah looked up at the glowing stained glass window, a cracked image of the Last Supper. "I ain't afraid of them." "They're afraid of you," Clayford said, voice grave. "And frightened men are dangerous." That same night, while Elijah slept, 3 masked men crept through the woods behind his house. They poured gasoline on his back fence and lit a match. The flames roared into the sky, licking at the stars. Elijah awoke to the sound of crackling heat and rushed outside barefoot, grabbing his garden hose and dousing the edges to keep the fire from spreading to his home. Neighbors watched from their porches. No one came to help. But someone did come the next morning: Charles Carson. When Elijah opened the door, shirtless and covered in soot, Charles was already holding a hammer and a stack of fresh lumber in his truck. "We're rebuilding that fence," he said. Elijah stared at him for a long moment. "You sure about that?" "I didn't save you on that road just to lose you to a fire," Charles replied. "Besides, my wife would kill me if I didn't help." The rebuilding drew attention. White and black residents alike stopped to watch as a rich white man worked side by side with a black handyman, hammering, sawing, sweating under the same sun. For some, it was a symbol of hope. For others, a threat. And threats turned into action. A group calling themselves the Palmetto Guard, an underground circle of segregationists, began leaving flyers across town. They were printed crudely and filled with veiled warnings. Southern tradition must be preserved. Beware those who forget their place. We're watching. The sheriff claimed he was investigating. But he never found anything. One night, Elijah was invited to speak at a local church event. Though hesitant, he agreed, not because he wanted to be a voice, but because he felt he couldn't stay silent anymore. Inside the tiny church, lit by flickering candles and ceiling fans that groaned like weary old men, Elijah stood in front of a crowd of 50 or so. Black families, a few white ones, including the Carsons, all waiting to hear from the man who had unknowingly become a symbol. "I ain't no preacher," he began, his voice steady. "I ain't no leader either. I'm just a man who fixed a truck, pulled a woman out, and built a fence again when they tried to burn it down. Laughter stirred gently through the crowd. But I do know this: hate don't build nothin'. It only tears down. And I'm tired of tearing down. Ain't y'all? The crowd murmured agreement. He continued, I don't want to be famous. I don't want a statue. I just want my niece to walk into the diner and not get stared at. I want to sit on a bench without someone saying, you're in the wrong place. And I want to live in a town that don't hide its kindness behind whispers. There was a long pause. Then clapping. Then standing. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt something in the room shift, not the world, maybe, but the weight of it. But peace was fleeting. 2 days later, Emily Carson disappeared. She had gone to the library after school, like always, but never came home. Margaret called every neighbor, every store, every family friend. Charles drove up and down dirt roads in a panic. When Elijah heard the news, he felt cold to his bones. A note was found at the edge of the woods. If you won't keep your family separate, we'll do it for you. The town spiraled into chaos. Margaret collapsed from exhaustion. Charles nearly tore the sheriff's office apart, demanding a manhunt. Even Reverend Clayford organized a community search party. But Elijah, he didn't wait. He remembered the green car with no plates. He remembered the broken chicken coop. He remembered every cruel whisper and silent glare. And he knew where to go. There was a man named Orville Jennings, who ran a salvage yard on the edge of town. Mean as a snake, with a dog named Rebel and a history that smelled like gasoline and matches. Rumor had it he was part of the Palmetto Guard. Elijah had fixed his gate once and been told never to step foot back. He went anyway. As Elijah approached the scrapyard, the dog barked wildly from behind a rusted chain-link fence. Orville stepped out of his shack, shotgun in hand. Back off, Turner, he growled. I'm looking for Emily Carson. I don't know nothin'. Elijah's voice dropped. I think you do. Orville's eyes narrowed. You threatening me? No, Elijah said, I'm remembering who I am. In the distance, behind a pile of rusted car frames, Elijah heard a small, trembling voice. A whimper. Emily, he shouted. And then everything happened at once. The dog lunged. The shotgun lifted. Elijah moved like a bullet. He tackled Orville to the ground, the gun firing harmlessly into the sky. The dog stopped mid-sprint as if uncertain who the enemy was. And from behind a tarp, Emily emerged, her face dirty but whole. Sheriff Briggs arrived minutes later, tipped off by Elijah's quick call to Margaret before confronting Orville. Orville was arrested for kidnapping and unlawful possession of firearms. He claimed he was protecting the town's legacy. But the judge and the community didn't buy it. Emily ran to Elijah, wrapped her arms around him, and whispered, I knew you'd come. And Elijah, exhausted, bruised, but still standing, simply said, always. That night, the Carson porch was filled with neighbors, black and white. Margaret served lemonade. Charles told the story of Elijah's rescue. Children played in the yard. And for once, no one seemed to care about skin or history or silence. Even Sheriff Briggs raised a toast. To the man who reminded this town what courage looks like. Elijah raised his glass too, then looked at the stars. Somewhere, his ancestors were watching. And smiling. The rescue of Emily Carson made headlines across the county. For a brief moment, Willow Creek became a name people recognized not for its long-forgotten Civil War past or its dusty state fairgrounds, but for something else entirely, a black man risking his life to save a white girl, while a known white supremacist sat in jail awaiting federal charges. For most of the town, it was a wake-up call. But for some, it was a declaration of war. Elijah had become a hero, a name whispered in admiration in barbershops, praised from pulpits, and shouted across diner counters. And yet, as Reverend Clayford warned, heroes are easier to love than to follow. Within a week, anonymous pamphlets appeared again, this time less subtle, more desperate. Do not be fooled. This man is no saint. He divides. He corrupts. He'll burn this town to the ground if you let him. Elijah found one nailed to a telephone pole outside his home. He tore it down wordlessly and kept walking. He'd stopped reacting. That, in itself, made them more afraid. Inside his house, however, he was feeling it. The exhaustion. The weight. I didn't sign up to be the town symbol, he told Margaret during one of her visits. She was folding clean clothes into his cupboard. No one does. But the best symbols don't have to try, they just live right. He smiled. I just wanted to fix engines. Plant tomatoes. Listen to birds. You still can, she said. But don't pretend your silence wouldn't be louder than your voice. Across town, the Carson family faced their own storm. Charles had lost 3 clients at his law firm. One even told him, to his face, I don't trust a man who lets his daughter sit at a black man's table. At first, Charles kept quiet. But one night, after too many bourbons, he stood up at a Rotary Club dinner and said, if your idea of tradition involves hating someone who'd risk his life for your child, maybe your tradition deserves to die. He was never invited back. Meanwhile, Emily refused to return to school. Her classmates treated her like she was radioactive. Some thought she'd been brainwashed. Others blamed her for Orville Jennings' arrest. But Elijah had an idea. Let's build something, he told her one afternoon. What? Something that can't be burned down. They started with an abandoned lot near the edge of town, just weeds, broken glass, and old shopping carts. Emily brought her journal. Elijah brought tools. Charles donated lumber. Margaret brought chairs. And slowly, word spread. What began as a weekend cleanup turned into something bigger. A learning center. A garden. A place where black and white kids could read, play, and learn it together. They called it the Bridge Yard. At first, only a few dared to come. But once they saw Elijah building a treehouse for the kids, once they heard Emily teaching chess to a shy black boy named Marlon, once they watched Margaret host poetry readings under string lights, they came. They stayed. They smiled. But not everyone was smiling. One evening, Sheriff Briggs called Elijah into his office. I need to show you something, the sheriff said, locking the door behind them. He handed Elijah a folder. Inside were photographs, blurry, grainy surveillance shots of a meeting in a barn. Men with masks. Some faces recognizable: teachers, business owners, even a town council member. They're planning something, Briggs said. And it's not just talk anymore. These folks are scared of what you represent. And what's that? Elijah asked. Briggs leaned back in his chair. Proof that they're not in charge anymore. Elijah stared at the photos. So what happens now? I can't arrest someone for wearing a mask and mumbling hate, Briggs said. But I can warn you. That warning proved wise. One night, while Elijah was working late at the bridge yard, he heard tires screech. A group of masked men jumped the fence. They sprayed paint across the garden, racial slurs, threats, mockery. One of them lit a torch. But they didn't see Emily, hidden in the treehouse, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. They didn't see Sheriff Briggs's cruiser pulling up just minutes later. This time, there were arrests. No more shadows. No more excuses. In the aftermath, Elijah sat in the dirt, staring at the vandalized garden. Emily sat beside him, silent. After a long pause, she whispered, "Do we give up now?" He shook his head. "Now we build again." The next week, over 100 people showed up to help. Black grandmothers. White teenagers. Hispanic store owners. The librarian. Even a former bully who once spat at Elijah when he was a teen. Together, they replanted everything. They repainted walls. They lit the treehouse with solar lights. Someone donated a swing set. Someone else brought a barbecue grill. The bridge yard came back stronger, louder, brighter. And this time, the town stayed. One night, after everyone had left, Elijah sat alone under the stars. Emily had gone home. Charles and Margaret were asleep. The wind was soft, warm with spring. Footsteps approached. It was Reverend Clayford. "You were right," Elijah said, not looking up. "About what?" "Heroes are easier to love than to follow." The Reverend sat beside him. "Then it's a good thing you're not a hero. You're a farmer, a teacher, a brother. A man. That's harder. But more real." They sat in silence for a while. Then the Reverend asked, "What now?" Elijah looked up at the stars, smiled faintly. "Now," he said, "we teach the next ones how to stand tall when the world tells them to bow." Spring faded into summer. The flowers in the bridge yard bloomed brighter than ever. Children's laughter floated through the air like music. It seemed for a moment that peace had come to Willow Creek. But beneath the surface, something cracked. It started subtly. A few families who once brought their children to the bridge yard stopped coming. Donations slowed. Some neighbors crossed the street rather than wave at Elijah. And then one morning, the front door of the center was spray painted again. No message this time. Just red paint, thick, angry, silent. Elijah stared at it for a long while, then calmly painted over it himself. But that silence? It was louder than ever. At the Carson house, Charles was also under pressure. After publicly supporting Elijah for months, he'd earned more enemies than friends. His law office had lost almost every white client. The board of directors of his country club reconsidered his membership. And now, the town council, of which he'd been a proud member for 8 years, was beginning a quiet campaign to have him removed. It was at one of these council meetings that the tension erupted. A vote was being held to rename the Confederate soldier statue in front of the courthouse to honor local unity. One name had been submitted: Elijah Turner. The council room air was thick with discomfort. One man, Councilman Harris, stood up, red-faced. "This is an insult. That statue honors history." To some, Charles said calmly. To others, it's a symbol of hate. And Elijah? Harris scoffed. "What did he ever do that warrants a statue?" "He saved my daughter," Charles said. "He stood for what's right when most people stayed quiet. That deserves more than a statue." The motion was denied. 5 votes to 2. After the meeting, Charles found a note tucked under his windshield wiper. "One day, you'll regret choosing them over your own." That same week, a man Elijah hadn't seen in 20 years came knocking. Walter Green. Tall, sharp-featured, and smiling like the past didn't matter. Elijah had known Walter back when they were teenagers, friends, almost brothers. But Walter had left the South years ago. Rumors said he'd made it big in Chicago. "You built something here, Walter said, walking through the bridge yard with admiration. "I read about you in the papers. You ever think about expanding this? Taking it nationwide?" Elijah chuckled. "Nationwide? I'm just trying to keep the weeds out of the tomato bed." Walter's tone shifted. "I'm serious. I've got backers. Real money. You let me bring in my people, we can turn this into a foundation. You'll have offices, staff, a platform." Elijah paused. Something in Walter's voice felt rehearsed. "What's in it for you?" Elijah asked. Walter smiled. "Legacy. For both of us." That night, Elijah lay awake. The thought of bringing hope to more towns, helping more kids, it stirred something in him. But something about Walter's smooth talk and expensive watch made his gut tighten. He decided to ask Charles. But Charles wasn't so sure anymore. "You don't trust him?" Elijah asked. "I don't trust easy answers," Charles replied. "Walter left this town when it needed him most. Now he comes back when it's safe? That's not courage. That's timing." Elijah nodded. "Still, the kids could use the funding. Just make sure you're not selling them a dream that someone else owns. 2 weeks later, Walter hosted a Unity Gala at the town community center. It was flashy. Lights, cameras, donors from the city. Elijah wore the only suit he owned. Margaret helped him fix the collar. "This is your night," she smiled. But it wasn't. Because halfway through the evening, Walter got on stage and announced something that Elijah had never agreed to. "We are proud to announce that the bridge yard is being restructured under the Green Unity Foundation, led by myself and a new board of investors." The crowd applauded. Elijah's stomach dropped. He stood. "Walter, we didn't talk about this." Walter didn't blink. "We'll sort the details later, smile. This is progress." "No," Elijah said, voice loud and clear. "This is theft." Gasps echoed. Cameras rolled. This place wasn't built with press releases and cocktail parties. It was built by hands covered in dirt. By kids with bruises and mothers with poems. You don't get to rename it and pretend it was yours. The next morning, headlines read: "Local hero causes scene at Unity Gala." "Internal dispute threatens racial progress." "Elijah Turner rejects foundation funding." Donors pulled out. Sponsors vanished. Even the sheriff quietly warned, "They're turning you into a liability." The bridge yard suffered. Classes were cancelled. A pipe burst. And through it all, Elijah never said a bitter word. But something in his eyes went dim. Then came the final blow. Walter, with the backing of wealthy investors, bought the lot next to the bridge yard and announced plans to build a modern community center of his own. Flashier. Bigger. Private security. No troublemakers. It was clear, he wanted to erase what Elijah had built and rewrite the story. Margaret came to Elijah's house the night of the announcement. She was shaking. "I never thought I'd see someone betray you so cleanly," she said. "What are you going to do?" Elijah was quiet. Then he stood. "I'm going to finish what I started." 3 days later, Elijah called a town meeting. In the same church where he'd once said he wasn't a preacher, he now stood in front of a room packed with people: black, white, young, old, media, strangers. He didn't read from paper. He didn't wear a tie. He spoke like a man who'd seen the heart of a town and still believed in its better angels. "I ain't interested in building empires. I'm interested in building people. I don't want cameras. I want conversations. I don't need a statue. I need a bench for tired mothers, and a garden for kids who never learn peace." And then he did something no one expected. "Today, I'm giving the bridge yard away." Gasps filled the room. Not to Walter. Not to investors. To the people. It will belong to whoever shows up. Whoever waters the plants. Whoever sweeps the floor. No nameplate. No title. Just a garden with roots in truth. He stepped down from the podium, handed the keys to an elderly black woman in the front row, and walked out. That night, Charles stood with him on the bridge yard path. "You sure you want to let it go?" Charles asked. "I'm not letting it go," Elijah said. "I'm letting it grow." And in the stillness of that summer night, as fireflies danced over tomato vines and wind chimes sang softly in the breeze, Elijah Turner disappeared into the quiet. A man who never wanted to be a hero. But became one, anyway. 10 years passed. The roads of Willow Creek were smoother now. The trees lining Main Street had grown taller, their branches reaching over sidewalks like protective arms. The old grocery store had turned into a co-op. The Confederate statue had been quietly removed, replaced not with a monument, but a circular bench, where folks of every color sat and talked on warm afternoons. But Elijah Turner was nowhere to be found. He had left the same way he had lived, quietly, purposefully, without asking permission. Rumor had it he'd moved up north. Others said he lived off the grid in Tennessee. One person claimed he became a teacher in Atlanta under a different name. No one knew for sure. Except Emily. Emily Carson was now 24. She wore boots, ran workshops, taught children chess in the same Bridgyard treehouse she'd once hidden in. Her hair was longer now, her voice firmer. But she carried a fire in her eyes, the same one Elijah had lit years ago. She never talked about the kidnapping. Not directly. But every time a scared kid came to her asking if the world was ever going to get better, she told them about a man who planted sunflowers where people once cursed. And when they asked where he was now, she smiled and said, "Still growing somewhere." Charles Carson, older now, walked with a cane. But he still came to every Bridgyard community dinner. He'd become something of a quiet elder in town, not because of his title, but because of his choices. He had fought the long war not with fists, but with decisions. He'd once said to his wife, "We raised a daughter who saw past skin and into souls. That's my proudest case." The Bridgyard was no longer just a garden. Over the years, it had grown into a movement. No headlines, no speeches, no political platforms, just action. People from nearby towns came to learn. Then from other counties. Then from other states. What Elijah had started had taken root. But still, there was one story left untold. One fall morning, Emily found a letter in the community center mailbox. It was old. The paper yellowed, the ink faded. No return address. Just 3 words on the front. For the Bridgyard. She opened it. Inside was a note, handwritten, in Elijah's unmistakable script. "If you're reading this, it means you kept going. I knew you would. You were always braver than me. People will try to own good things. They'll stamp their names on gardens and foundations and statues. But some things don't belong to anyone. They just are. Like music. Or sunlight. Or truth. I was never meant to lead. I was meant to protect the flame until someone younger and wilder could carry it further. That's you, Emily. That's all of you. So don't look for me. Look for each other. And when the weeds come back, and they will, you dig your hands in the dirt and you plant anyway. Yours in the quiet. Elijah." Emily sat on the wooden bench beside the garden and cried. Not because she was sad. But because she finally understood. Elijah hadn't left. He'd simply become part of everything. That evening, the Bridgyard held its annual lantern ceremony. Each year, they floated small paper lanterns down the creek, each one holding a message, a thank you, a hope, a promise. Emily lit one and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me before I saw myself." Charles lit his own, shakily. You turned a moment into a movement. Even Sheriff Briggs came, lighting one in silence. No cameras. Just respect. Hundreds of lanterns flickered down the creek, the water catching their glow like fireflies. And as they disappeared into the night, a little boy tugged on Emily's sleeve. "Miss Emily," he asked, "was Elijah real?" She smiled and looked out toward the darkened horizon. Realer than most. That night, in a home miles away, maybe a cabin, maybe a quiet apartment, a man with calloused hands and silver hair looked up at the sky. He didn't have a phone. Didn't need one. He just smiled. Somewhere, his roots were growing stronger than ever.